There's a certain kind of silence that lives behind prison walls, a silence thick enough to carry tension, secrets, and rage. It's a silence that can break at any moment, erupting into violence so fierce it shakes the very foundations of authority. This is the story of when that silence shattered, when control slipped from the hands of guards and chaos took over. From the outside, prisons are seen as fortresses of control, steel bars, concrete walls, and watchtowers that promise order. But inside, beneath the layers of routine and discipline, a different world exists. One built on survival, power, and fear. For inmates, every day is a negotiation. Respect, territory, food, or even just the right to breathe without being challenged. It's a powder keg waiting for a spark. And sometimes, that spark ignites a riot that becomes legend. Our story begins in the early 1970s at the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York, a place forever marked by one of the most violent prison uprisings in American history. On the morning of September the 9th, 1971, tensions that had been simmering for years finally exploded. The prisoners, frustrated by inhumane conditions, overcrowding, and the lack of basic rights, decided they had reached their breaking point. What began as a protest quickly spiraled into full-blown chaos. Within minutes, over 1,200 inmates seized control of the prison. Guards were taken hostage, cell blocks were overrun, and the inmates set up makeshift barricades. Smoke filled the air as fires burned, and the sound of shouts, breaking glass, and boots on concrete echoed through the facility. For 4 long days, Attica was no longer under state control. It was a city ruled by prisoners. The inmates presented demands: better living conditions, access to medical care, religious freedom, and an end to brutality. On the surface, their words spoke of justice, but inside those walls, something darker was at play: fear, power struggles, and desperation. Negotiations between the inmates and state officials dragged on. The tension built like a coiled spring, waiting to snap. And then, it did. On September 13th, the governor ordered state police and correctional officers to retake the prison. Helicopters roared overhead, dropping tear gas canisters into the yard. Inmates, choking and blinded, ran in every direction as gunfire erupted. The assault lasted just 15 minutes, but by the time the smoke cleared, 43 people lay dead, including both inmates and hostages. The walls of Attica ran red that day. The world outside watched in horror as images of bloodied prisoners and armed officers filled TV screens. What was supposed to be a controlled retaking turned into one of the deadliest prison riots in U.S. history. And even today, decades later, the word Attica still echoes as a symbol of rebellion, brutality, and the price of injustice. But Attica wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. Across the world, in every maximum security prison, wardens and governments took notice. Because when human beings are pushed to their limits, even the thickest walls can't contain the chaos that follows. From the United States to South America, from Europe to Asia, history would soon repeat itself. Each riot born from a different story: neglect, corruption, oppression, but all ending the same way: in violence, destruction, and loss. Behind every riot there's a pattern: overcrowded cells, rotten food, extreme heat or cold, brutality from guards, and hopelessness. When hope dies, rebellion takes its place. The human mind can endure a lot, but not endless suffering. When you mix desperation with numbers, you get a force even barbed wire can't stop. For the inmates of Attica, it was never just about escape. It was about being seen, being heard, and reclaiming a shred of dignity in a system that had stripped it away. But in the aftermath, their cries were drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the heavy silence that followed. Every corner of the prison told the story of those 4 days. Burned mattresses, shattered windows, graffiti scrawled with messages of freedom and fury. The smell of smoke lingered long after the riot was over, a reminder that rebellion had a price, and that price was blood. In the days that followed, investigators combed through the aftermath, trying to piece together what went wrong. The public demanded answers. Some called the inmates monsters, others called them martyrs. But one truth remained undeniable. Attica had exposed the cracks in the system. It showed the world that even inside the most secure walls, the human spirit cannot be fully contained. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. Wherever there is injustice, rebellion is only a matter of time. Before we continue, take a moment to think about this. If an entire prison could rise up against its keepers, what other uprisings have been buried beneath history's silence? In the next chapter, we'll journey far beyond America's borders to one of the bloodiest prison riots ever recorded, the Carandiru Massacre in Brazil. A riot so violent, so shocking, that it changed the entire country's prison system forever. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because this story only gets darker, more intense, and more unbelievable from here. What happened at Attica was just the beginning. There are moments in history when violence becomes so extreme that it no longer feels real, when a single event forces an entire nation to confront its conscience. For Brazil, that moment came on October 2nd, 1992, inside a sprawling concrete labyrinth known as Carandiru Penitentiary. A prison that would soon become a symbol of brutality, corruption, and loss of humanity. Carandiru was the largest prison in Latin America, housing over 8,000 inmates in a space meant for half that number. Built to contain society's most dangerous criminals, it had become a living nightmare. Cells overflowed. Disease ran rampant. Violence was common. Food was scarce. And the guards, outnumbered and overwhelmed, ruled through fear. Those who had lived there described it as a city within a city, a place where inmates created their own order, their own rules, their own kings. There were factions, drug rings, and unwritten laws that determined who survived and who didn't. Every day inside Carandiru was a struggle for dominance or survival. But on that fateful day in October, all of that would collapse in a matter of hours. It began like many riots do, with a fight. Two rival gangs clashed during a soccer match in the prison yard. At first it was fists and shouts. Then came knives, shanks, and blood. Panic spread through the blocks as the fight escalated, and within minutes the entire prison erupted into chaos. Guards fled as prisoners stormed corridors, breaking locks, setting fires, and seizing control of sections of the facility. Smoke filled the air. The deafening sound of metal slamming against concrete echoed like thunder. For hours, the riot raged unchecked. Inmates shouted from windows, waving shirts and cloths, pleading for calm, for order, for someone to take control. But there was no control left. Outside the prison walls, the military police assembled. Heavily armed units surrounded Carandiru, waiting for orders. The government feared a mass breakout, 8,000 desperate men spilling into the city streets. The governor's order was chillingly simple: retake the prison at all costs. By mid-afternoon, armored vehicles rolled through the gates. Soldiers moved in formation, rifles raised. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping the air. What followed was one of the most brutal assaults in modern prison history. The military police stormed the blocks, firing indiscriminately. Inmates, many unarmed, ran for cover behind walls, under bunks, inside bathrooms, but there was nowhere to hide. Witnesses later described scenes of unimaginable horror. Men lined up against walls, pleading for mercy, others crawling through pools of blood, trying to reach safety. The sound of gunfire echoed for hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 111 prisoners were dead. Not a single police officer had been killed. The aftermath was chaos. The prison floors were slick with blood. Smoke drifted through shattered windows. The dead were stacked in corridors, their faces frozen in disbelief. Survivors were forced to strip, lie face down and wait. hours, sometimes days, for questioning. When news of the massacre reached the outside world, outrage spread like wildfire. Human rights organizations demanded investigations. Journalists called it an execution. And yet, for years, no one was held accountable. It wasn't until 2013, 21 years later, that several police officers involved in the massacre were finally convicted. But for the families of the dead, justice had come too late. The Carandiru massacre wasn't just an event. It was a mirror held up to Brazil's broken prison system. It revealed a world where overcrowding, corruption, and dehumanization had turned punishment into annihilation. Even today, survivors speak of the sound of gunfire that still haunts their dreams. Some describe how the walls of the prison seemed to tremble that day, as if the building itself mourned the lives lost within it. And perhaps the darkest irony of all, Carandiru Penitentiary was eventually demolished, replaced by a park and memorial. But the soil beneath still remembers. The concrete may be gone, but the ghosts remain. When we talk about violent prison riots, we often imagine chaos that spirals out of control. But Carandiru was different. It wasn't chaos that ended it. It was order, cold and merciless. A government's iron fist crushing its own citizens behind locked gates. It's a story that asks hard questions. When does control become cruelty? When does justice become vengeance? And when the walls run red, who gets to decide what's right? Carandiru forced the world to look at prisons not just as institutions of punishment, but as pressure cookers of pain. And when the pressure explodes, the damage spreads far beyond the walls. As we move deeper into this series, we'll cross continents to uncover another story, one that shook Europe to its core. A riot so violent, so meticulously planned, it turned a British prison into a war zone. Make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because what happened next in Strangeways prison in the United Kingdom will make you realize violence doesn't need permission. It only needs opportunity. The morning of April 1st, 1990, began like any other at Strangeways prison in Manchester, England. Guards unlocked cell doors, prisoners filed out for church service, and the day moved under the routine hum of control. But within those stone walls, frustration had been building, quietly, dangerously, for years. Overcrowding, filth, rotting food, inadequate medical care, and a system that crushed both body and spirit. The inmates were angry, desperate, and humiliated. They had been ignored too long, and on that April morning, their silence finally broke. During a chapel service attended by more than 300 prisoners, one inmate rose to his feet, shouting a phrase that would ignite chaos. "We're taking the prison!" The words rippled through the chapel like a spark through dry grass. Within moments, pews were overturned, glass shattered, and guards were overpowered. Inmates surged through the corridors, seizing keys, breaking locks, and freeing others from their cells. By noon, the prisoners had taken complete control of Strangeways. From the outside, the Victorian-era prison looked like a fortress, impenetrable, unyielding. But inside, it had turned into a battlefield. Smoke poured from windows. Inmates waved banners and bedsheets from the rooftop, scrawled with messages that read, "No more brutality," and "We will not be silent." The prison staff fled as rioters stormed the main blocks, smashing doors, destroying offices, and setting fires. Loudspeakers blared, alarms screamed, and above it all, the voices of hundreds of prisoners rose in a defiant roar that could be heard across Manchester. For the next 25 days, Strangeways was under siege. British authorities surrounded the facility, helicopters circling overhead. Families of inmates gathered outside, holding signs, praying, shouting for answers. News crews broadcast live as the world watched one of the longest and most violent prison riots in modern history unfold. Inside, conditions grew worse by the hour. Food supplies dwindled. The smell of smoke, sweat and decay filled the air. Some prisoners turned violent, attacking rivals or looting cells. Others, those who had started the riot, tried to establish order. They negotiated through bullhorns with officials outside, demanding better living conditions, an end to overcrowding, and basic human rights. But communication was chaotic. And as days turned into weeks, Strangeways descended deeper into madness. Inmates used debris to build barricades and traps. They armed themselves with pipes, bricks, and makeshift weapons. The sound of boots on metal catwalks echoed through the cell blocks at night, as guards and negotiators moved cautiously, unsure what awaited them in the dark. The rooftop became the symbol of rebellion. Television cameras zoomed in on the silhouettes of shirtless prisoners standing against the grey Manchester sky, waving flags made from bedsheets. They shouted down to reporters, exposing the horrors of life inside British prisons: overcrowded cells, 23-hour lockups, and endless abuse. The public watched with mixed emotions, some angry at the destruction, others sympathetic to the cause. But one thing was clear: Strangeways was no longer just a riot. It was a reckoning. By April 25th, after nearly 4 weeks, the standoff finally came to an end. Exhausted, starving, and surrounded by armed officers, the last prisoners on the roof surrendered. The siege was over. But the cost was enormous. The riot left 2 people dead, 1 prisoner and 1 officer, and more than 140 injured. The prison itself was nearly destroyed from the inside, with damages exceeding £55 million. It took years to rebuild both the structure and the system that had allowed it to collapse. In the aftermath, a public inquiry exposed the truth. British prisons were dangerously overcrowded, understaffed, and inhumane. The Strangeways riot forced massive reforms across the United Kingdom. Conditions improved, cells were renovated, and policies were changed. But the scars, both physical and psychological, remained. One former inmate later said, "We didn't start that riot for fun. We started it because we were already dying in there, just slower." That's the chilling paradox of every prison riot. To the outside world, they look like explosions of chaos. But inside, they are often acts of desperation, cries for dignity that erupt when no one is listening. And yet, the longer the siege dragged on, the more Strangeways became something else, a symbol of defiance. For some inmates, it wasn't just about conditions. It was about power, control, revenge. When a system dehumanizes people long enough, they'll do anything to feel human again, even if it means setting the world on fire. In the end, the smoke cleared, the flags came down, and the walls of Strangeways stood silent once more. But that silence wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. The Strangeways riot became a case study for every prison system around the world, showing how thin the line is between order and anarchy. One bad meal, one insult, one spark, and a prison can turn into a war zone. But as history has shown, the story doesn't end in Manchester. There are riots that make Strangeways look small by comparison, uprisings that turned prisons into killing fields. In the next chapter, we travel to El Salvador to witness one of the most terrifying modern riots ever recorded, a scene so brutal that even hardened gang members wept at what they saw. Make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because Chapter 4 will take you into the heart of hell itself, where prisoners fought not for freedom, but for survival. If hell had a street address, in 2022, it might have been written on the walls of El Salvador's prisons. For years, the country's penitentiaries were not correctional centers. They were fortresses of gang empires, ruled by the most dangerous criminal organizations in Latin America, MS-13 and Barrio 18. But that year, something changed. President Nayib Bukele, a man both loved and feared, had declared an all-out war on gangs. Overnight, thousands of suspected gang members were rounded up and thrown behind bars. The country's prisons, already packed beyond capacity, became pressure cookers of violence and rage. And it didn't take long for that pressure to explode. Inside Izalco prison, one of the most notorious facilities in El Salvador, guards watched in dread as tensions between rival gangs reached a boiling point. These weren't petty criminals. They were tattooed warriors of the streets, men who had killed, tortured, and ruled entire neighborhoods. And now they were trapped together in cells built for half their number, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on concrete floors, under flickering lights that never went out. No weapons, no phones, no freedom. Just hate. Day 1. The air was thick, humid, and silent. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. The guards had received warnings, whispers of a plot, coded messages passed through food trays, gang signs carved into walls. But they dismissed it. They'd heard such rumors before. Then came the scream. A sound so raw and violent it froze everyone in their tracks. Within minutes, chaos ripped through the cell blocks. Prisoners from MS-13 clashed with members of Barrio 18 in a brutal eruption of rage. Fists became weapons. Metal bed frames were torn apart and sharpened into blades. Smoke began to rise as fires lit the night sky. Guards tried to intervene, but it was too late. The riot had spread faster than anyone could react. Radios crackled with shouts of, "We've lost control of Block C," and "They're killing each other." For the next 48 hours, Izalco prison turned into a war zone. The gang leaders, who once ruled the outside world, were now fighting for dominance inside. Walls dripped with soot and blood. Prisoners used torn clothing as masks, shouting war cries and dragging wounded rivals into corners. Every hallway echoed with the clash of metal, the pounding of boots, and the desperate prayers of those who just wanted to survive. Outside the gates, soldiers in black tactical gear surrounded the complex. Helicopters hovered overhead. Families gathered beyond the fences, crying, screaming their loved ones' names, hoping for a miracle. But no one was allowed in. No one was coming out. The government called it a security emergency. Human rights groups called it a massacre waiting to happen. Inside, food and water ran out. The smell of sweat, smoke, and rot hung over the prison like a curse. Guards, outnumbered and terrified, barricaded themselves inside control rooms, watching through security cameras as the inmates tore through the blocks. Bodies were dragged across hallways. Fires burned through sheets and mattresses. Some prisoners, desperate to escape the flames, tried climbing onto the rooftops, only to be met with warning shots from guards who had orders to shoot if necessary. The riot lasted 3 days. When soldiers finally stormed the prison, the scene was indescribable. Charred walls, pools of blood, the sound of moaning survivors echoing through corridors that looked more like battlegrounds than prison blocks. Official reports claimed dozens of inmates were killed, but witnesses whispered that the true number was far higher. The government refused to release full details, determined to show the world that order had been restored. But the images that leaked online told a darker truth. Lines of shirtless, tattooed men forced to kneel in rows, their heads bowed, surrounded by armed soldiers in black masks. A haunting display of power, control, and fear. El Salvador's prisons were no longer just detention centers. They had become symbols of the country's war on crime, of justice and vengeance, of the razor-thin line between safety and cruelty. And while many citizens cheered the government's crackdown, calling it necessary, others saw a different reality. A nation where Brutality fought brutality, and humanity was lost in between. Inside those walls, men who once commanded terror on the streets now lived in total submission. Heads shaved, wrists chained, faces pressed to the ground. There were no riots anymore. Just silence. A silence born from fear. Historians would later call it the end of an era, when El Salvador finally crushed its gangs by crushing everything within its prisons. But for those who survived, the memory never faded. The screams, the smoke, the smell of burning flesh. Those who witnessed it said it felt like the world had ended and restarted in the same moment. And maybe it had. Because that's the dark truth behind every prison riot in history. They don't just happen because of violence. They happen because of neglect, desperation, and the breaking point of the human soul. From Attica to Strangeways, from Carandiru to Izalco, every riot tells the same story, a warning about what happens when power and suffering collide. And yet, every time the smoke clears, the question remains. Did we learn anything? Or are we just waiting for the next prison to explode? If you followed this journey through the darkest chapters of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. More incredible true stories are coming. Stories that reveal the raw truth of humanity, justice, and survival. Because in this world, some walls don't just keep people in, they keep the truth out.